All right. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening, whenever y'all decide to watch this. I hope y'all are having a good first week of classes. Obviously, this is definitely a little bit different than your normal first week, but I hope it's going well nonetheless. So again, my name is Matt Atkinson. I am your lecturer for this class, and I hope y'all are enjoying the first lecture so far. And hopefully between the next 2 or 3 lectures or so, we'll really start kind of digging into what science is and isn't, as well as start actually getting to what biology is here soon. So bear with me a little bit. I'm still quite getting used to some of the technology stuff, so it may take me a day or two to get everything sorted out, but hopefully everything should work out perfectly. So let's go ahead and start with some quick class reminders. Remember again that syllabus quiz is due by Friday, August 28th. So that's, the last day of the week. And make sure you don't accidentally take the quiz for the wrong class. This is really, really important to do because it lets financial aid know that you're actually participating in the class, so you get your money. Do this quiz. It's really, really important for you. Unfortunately, there's no extra credit or anything for it, but do make sure you do this. It is really important. And don't forget as well, you have your week 1 quiz due by next Monday, August 31st. Basically, as soon as it hits midnight on August 31st, it will close and you won't have access to it. Again, remember you have 30 minutes to take each quiz, and your 12 best quizzes will be what is actually graded. So if you miss one, it's not the total end of the world, but you really should try to make sure you're doing them. So seating this class, you really need to do a lot of different things. Especially with it being asynchronous, it's going to be a little bit odd compared to how it normally is. So the big important thing is to make sure you're watching all 3 lectures at normal speed. Obviously, with YouTube, you are given the ability to speed it up. And while that does have its benefits, I would actually really recommend not doing so, because unfortunately, you're going to miss some things that your brain's not going to be able to comprehend everything that's coming at you. Take notes. You have access to the PowerPoints with notes sections right next to them. Go through, and as I'm going through each slide, take notes on those slides. So that way you make sure you know what's going on. And finally, while you're watching these lectures, make sure you're not using social media or if you're getting distracted. And when that does start to happen, again, it's an asynchronous class. The best thing you can do is pause it, walk away, and then come back and restart anew, because that will give you a lot more opportunities to just be able to sit and actually take in that information. Now remember, this is a 3-hour credit course, which means that for every hour that you spend in class, you're going to be spending about 2 to 3 hours outside of it. So, while you have 3 hours of class per week, you really need to be spending somewhere between 6 to 9 hours total on this class a week to make sure you're being successful. Which I really want to see if everybody got A's in this class, I'd be absolutely ecstatic. I'm not one of those people that thinks you need to curve down so you can remove good grades. That's stupid. But again, you do need to make sure you're spending the right amount of time on this class. That means studying. What I'd actually really recommend is to watch the lectures, take your notes, and then transcribe that into another document. So that's what always helped me when I was in college. So again, make sure you're reviewing the notes, that you're watching the videos that are also embedded in the slides. Those can be really useful as well. And just make sure you're taking really copious good notes. And finally, come to office hours if you have questions. Ask questions in the discussion section on Canvas or in the chat section on Canvas. That's really going to help you make sure you're getting everything you possibly can. So I'm sure this is something that y'all are already concerned about as well. What's going to be on the exams? So obviously the information, any information that's on the slide, which includes definitions, so any of those bold words that we mentioned earlier, video content that I linked to is totally fair game, as well as any of the diagrams. And I'm not going to be totally a jerk about it, but I might put a picture up there and say, hey, what is A, B, or C? So some things to think about. So some more specific examples so say from last unit, I can ask you, what is a control variable? And in that case, or a control, you'll say, hey, this is a variable that You are controlling for that, so going back to our plant example that we talked about last week or last lecture, you know, what things are you doing for that plant to make sure that it's not different from any other reasons besides breeding a tall plant and a short plant. All right, so kind of getting back into our main lecture for today. Remember, on the previous lecture, we broke apart the concept of a scientific study, which consists of an observation, hypothesis, prediction, an experiment, analysis, interpretation, peer review, and publication. Today, we're going to look a little bit more closely at the concept of life and kind of get into what is biology. So, biology is a scientific study of life. Biology is derived from two ancient Greek words, bios, which means life, and logia, to speak or a branch of study. Thus, biology means a scientific study of life. So life is everywhere, but it can be really, really difficult to define. The classic example of this is viruses. While we primarily decide that viruses aren't life, they do have a lot of things that could be, at least from the outside, make them look like life. So it gets kind of convoluted and a little bit messy. Now, biologists study all forms of life. So you could be a biologist and be studying, single-celled organisms that only exist in these very, very concentrated areas, or you could be studying entire populations or ecosystems of animals and plants and all that kind of fun stuff. So it all just kind of depends. The big thing is remember that each living individual is known as an organism. So I'm an organism, my dog's an organism, you're an organism, that sort of thing. So the big thing that we need to remember, though, is it's really difficult to define what life is, despite we have a general intuitive sense of what it is. So if we see a snake sunning on the rock, we know a snake's alive, but the rock isn't. But it's difficult to state just what makes a snake alive. And so because of that, we have to kind of create these very arbitrary rules that at least will get us like 95% of the way there. So we start with these rules. The first thing that we need to remember is that all organisms are made of cells. The cells are the basic unit of life. Every organism consists of at least one, if not thousands or millions or trillions, depending on the organism. And every cell has a membrane that separates it from its outsides and encloses water as well as other chemicals to carry out cellular function. So we have simple single-celled organisms. We call them unicellular. So one cell. Whereas more complex organisms like you and I, as well as even some what you would assume would be just a single-celled organism, can also be multicellular as well. And again, multicellular, multi-cells, pretty straightforward. And all organisms have what we call DNA. So DNA is a molecule that carries genetic information. And granted, I understand, y'all, this is probably a lot of review for you. And it is what's used to pass on information from one generation to the next. All cells use DNA to produce proteins, which carry out the work that cells do. So without DNA, your body could not function. So DNA is just essential for cells. It carries the genetic information, it produces proteins, and it just, you would not function without it. What's funny, though, is if you just list the biochemicals that make up life, it's not necessarily a satisfactory definition of life. One of the reasons for that is that we can place DNA, membrane, water, and proteins in a test tube, but it doesn't mean that life is just going to spontaneously combust. And this has been tried scientifically quite a few times, and honestly, it just never quite worked out. So the question remains is, how do you determine if something is truly alive? So life is defined by its characteristics. And honestly, when it comes down to it, there's no true concise definition of what is life. So our answer is that we have kind of settled on 5 qualities and that in combination we use to determine if something is living or not. And these 5 qualities are organization, energy, internal constancy, reproduction, growth and development, and evolution. So just kind of looking off the top here already, you can see where we talked about, all organisms are made of cells, right? So that's talking about that internal constancy. So you're maintaining your own environment. All organisms have some sort of DNA, which goes down to the reproduction, growth, and development, as well as the evolution side of things. And to some extent, it goes to energy and organization as well. So just those two little things are kind of already guiding all 5 of these factors that we're thinking about. And the thing is characteristics of life is organized. So consider a city. A city is within a county is within a state within a country, and a country is within Earth. Similarly, life is organized from the smallest components to the largest components, with the smallest components being an atom and the largest being the epibiosphere. In other words, the entire Earth itself. Additionally, when we're talking about life being organized, matter that makes up life is organized into atoms. So if we zoom into our first component of an atom, or indivisible in Greek, atoms are small chemical units of a type of pure substance. You probably saw that list of pure substances or elements before that are listed on what we call the periodic table of elements. So here's that example right here. So, all living matter and non-living matter is composed of atoms. So an atom isn't necessarily something that defines you as a living creature. These atoms are then formed into what we call a molecule. So a molecule is a group of joined atoms, and all matter, both living and non-living, is composed of molecules. Your classic examples are oxygen, the air that we breathe, is O2. Water, H2O. Nitrogen gas, and there's quite a few other molecules as well. These molecules are then organized into what we call organelles. Now, an organelle, for instance, this chloroplast that you see on the screen, where photosynthesis occurs in plants, are basically these structures that allow a cell to function. It's important to note that not all cells have organelles, and we will return to that which cell has organelles and which don't a bit later. But in general, all these molecules form into the structures of the cell, including the organelles, and then we finally get to our cells. So a cell, again, is the fundamental unit of life. No life form can be smaller in organization than a cell. This particular cell is of a plant cell, and you'll hear more about how to tell a plant and animal cell apart as we get into other chapters. These cells are then, especially if you're a multicellular organism, organized into tissues. So a leaf, if you look at a cross-section of a leaf, you can actually see all these cells forming together to create what that structure of the leaf is. And so, in other words, this leaf is a tissue. It's the conglomeration of all those cells together. There's special holes in the bottom, which allows CO2 to come in and oxygen to come out. And the red bundles that you see are the cross-sections of the leaf's vessels through which water and nutrients are transported. So you can have specialized tissues even within a set of tissues. Say, for instance, you're talking about your skin, you have glands in your skin. Your skin is your tissue, but you could also, it gets kind of hairy on how you define things. So there's some things to keep in mind. And finally, tissues are organized into organs. So if you're talking about a human, you talk about this subsection of skin that's on my hand, then you can talk about the entirety of my skin as being an organ. Or say, for instance, you're talking about somebody's muscles. Your entire muscle structure is an organ, but a specific muscle cluster is a tissue set. Hopefully that makes sense. And often these tissues come together and form, when they become organs, it often supports a specific function. So in this case, a leaf is probably the best way to describe it, is a great organ. In the sense that within a leaf, you have multiple different cell types that are formed into different types of tissues that are allowing that leaf to function. So it's collecting energy from the sun, converting it to a chemical energy, and then it's moving those chemical energy into the rest of the plant. And then you get into organ systems. So obviously we've talked about things like plants pretty well, but in this case, so you have the one single organ, which is the leaf. Now it's made up into a bunch of leaves. So that way you have all these leaves acting together. So that's kind of interesting. Or we can talk about more conventional stuff like, humans, where you have digestive systems, where it's not just the stomach, it's not just the small intestine, it's not just the large intestine. All these things work together to ultimately break down food from where it enters your mouth to pulling all the energy out to getting rid of what we also don't need at the end. So all this stuff is really important as far as like going from one step to another. Finally, all of these organs are collectively a part of an individual organism. So obviously, I am here as a person. I have multiple organ systems that are all working in harmony, hopefully, to, extract energy and keep me running and be able to talk to y'all while I'm talking about this class. But at the same time, it all kind of adds up. So that's that individual unit. Now, keep in mind that an organism doesn't have to have, we can be talking about single-celled organisms, which means that they may not have tissue or, organs or whatever. They'll just have organelles. So this is a pretty rough translation of like how you move from, an atom to a molecule to a cell to all that kind of thing. So take some of this with a grain of salt. Obviously, you're going to miss steps as you kind of move through the trees of life, but some things to keep in mind. And then you start getting to the fun stuff. Once you get past an individual organism, that's where you're going to get to the really interesting creatures. And the interactions between all these different species, we call that a population. So individual organisms, when they're interacting together, is known as a population. So when I'm talking about the number of lizards that you can find in your walk from your garage to, whatever dorm or whatever you're staying in, that is a population of lizards. They all live in the same general area. They probably also use the same resources, and they're all the same species. So kind of going back to our tree examples here, you've got a group of acacia trees that are scattered around the globe is not a population. But all of the acacia trees that live in a certain place for the past 200 years, probably not a population. A population is a group of species such as an acacia tree or rabbits or a lizard example within a particular space at a current time. So the key is that an organism has to have the opportunity to interact with each other. So those brown anoles that you see, the lizards, they have to be able to interact with each other. They have to be able to breed with each other. They have to be able to compete with resources with each other, all that kind of fun stuff. You can't say all of the brown anoles that have been seen for the last 20 years at UCF, that's not a population. That's too broad. Then you start getting in from populations into communities. This is where you go away from saying just a single species to all of the species in that particular animal group. So at that point, you're not just talking about the brown anoles. You might be talking about the green anoles that are also sharing space with them, or the curly-tailed lizards that live out on the tennis courts by Libra Garage, or the birds that might eat these critters, all that kind of fun stuff. So the big thing to remember here with communities is that it's all living organisms. So it doesn't include any non-living organisms. And that's when you get to an ecosystem. But ecosystem is all of the non-living and living components of an area. So in our plant example, we talk about the entirety of a savanna. In our case, we're talking about the entirety of the campus of UCF. Because you've got the buildings, you've got the rocks, you've got the plants, you've got the lizards, you've got the students. All of that stuff comes together to form the ecosystem that is UCF. And keep in mind too, ecosystems can be huge or they can be really small. So, when you're talking about the savannas in Africa, they stretch thousands and potentially millions of miles. Thousands of miles across. But when you're talking about UCF, what, 3 miles across? So, it does matter to some extent. So again, just because you're setting something as an ecosystem doesn't mean that it's necessarily constrained by physical space. It's more so, what are you defining as this? So again, back to our UCF example, all of UCF with its lizards and its plants and its students, that is an ecosystem. And then all of these ecosystems together ultimately get organized into what we call the biosphere. And there are a couple more steps that you can add to kind of differentiate between one ecosystem to another. But the global ecosystem and the parts of the planet and its atmosphere is where life is possible. So technically, this doesn't include Mars, it doesn't include Jupiter or whatever, but it does include everything that's on the Earth presently. So, pretty important. So that's kind of our general rundown of the organization of biology. So let's look at some of the other properties. This organization leads to what we call emergent properties. And these emergent properties arise at each level of biological organization. So let's go back to the example of the organic molecules and putting them in a tube. We can synthesize or isolate cell membranes, DNA, enzymes, and other proteins, fats, sugars, and put them in a tube, but it won't make life. This illustrates the emergent property that when the whole cell is greater than the sum of its parts. Or in other words, emergent properties are the new functions that arise from the interaction of the parts. Day-to-day example. If you take flour, butter, chocolate, and sugar, they can become brownies. And that is something that's not evident from the parts of them themselves. Similarly, organization leads to emergent properties. So a collection of brain cells interact and produce a memory. That's something that you wouldn't expect, right? There's entire organisms that go their entire lives without having a functioning brain. You also have emergent properties are heavily dependent on structural organization. So if you hit your head and disrupt communication between your brain cells, your memory's gone. Or if you leave out an ingredient in those brownies, it's not a brownie anymore. Or at least, depends on which ingredients and how you organize all that kind of fun stuff, but still. So, again, that's all of the organization side of things when it comes to what are the characteristics of life. So let's dig into energy a little bit here. So if you've ever heard of entropy, which simply means the lack of order or predictability, and a gradual decline to disorder. This is based off of the second law of thermodynamics, which states that all closed systems tend to maximize entropy in disorder. A lot of energy is needed to keep a system, quote unquote, in order and functioning. And energy is needed to carry out physical reactions. Sugar is composed of 3 elements, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. However, if you pump carbon dioxide into water, sugar will not just appear. Energy is needed to break chemical bonds in molecules and reassemble atoms into new molecules. Yet plants do this all the time. They use the sun's energy, which comes in and helps to break down carbon dioxide and water into sugar. And we'll talk more about this on another day, but as an organism is growing, it's going to get bigger. It has to have more cells, more matter. This matter has to come from somewhere, and it's from transformed energy, whether that be through consumption of some other organism or breaking down the air or the carbon dioxide and the water that it's intaking as a plant. There's a lot of different ways to get this. So this energy is really needed for keeping things organized, as well as carrying out chemical reactions like we just talked about, transporting molecules inside and outside of the cells, and maintaining internal constancy. Finally, reproduction, growth, and development is entirely dependent on can an organism get energy. So not all organisms obtain their energy through the same way. So you have producers. So your producers are things also better known as autotrophs, which is from the Greek self-feeders. Auto, self, troph, feeder. They convert sun energy and nutrients from soil and other places into organic matter. So these are going to be plants, protists, a lot of prokaryotes also do this as well, and some unicellular organisms without a nucleus. But then you have consumers. This is our second group, better known as heterotrophs. So hetero means other, trophs mean feed, so they're other feeders. And these are usually your animals, a lot of protists, so things like particularly pathogenic protists, think like malaria. There's a lot of prokaryotes that tend to obtain energy this way as well. And don't forget, even fungi will help break down things as consumers. But honestly, we probably go ahead and classify fungi as kind of their own thing. This is known as decomposers. So decomposers are consumers that get their energy and nutrients from waste or dead organisms. So fungi is probably a great example of this. Another more animal-focused example is an earthworm, where you've got something moving through the underbrush or moving through the soil that's breaking down organic matter that's already there. So we've done a pretty good job of covering, organization and energy. So these are two of our characteristics of life. Let's go ahead and move on to internal constancy. So conditions inside a cell must remain constant. Otherwise, the cell itself will die. If it's too hot, proteins are going to be destroyed. And this is often anything above about 105 degrees Fahrenheit or 41 degrees Celsius. If it's too cold, water freezes, expands, and tears the cell's membranes apart. And keep in mind, too, there are organisms that have been evolved ways to get past this. But for the most part, these heat and cold are going to destroy things. Um, Especially if you think about it from a perspective, have you ever tried to cool down a drink by putting a can or a plastic bottle in a freezer and accidentally forgot about it? Often that can or bottle is going to explode because all of that pressure and ice builds up and fractures whatever was holding it together. And then you get to clean up Diet Dr. Pepper out of your freezer. So it's the same kind of thing that can happen with the human body. And that's why it's actually really difficult to freeze human bodies. So thinking about specifically with humans, when it gets too cold, you start shivering, which is to help create heat to try to keep you warm. And that's heat from muscle movement. Um, your lips turn blue because your circulatory system focuses on keeping your more vital organs warm, because ultimately your skin is not the most important part of you. And if it's too hot, we sweat. That sweat evaporates from our skin surface, and energy is required to tear the water molecules off of the skin surface, which cools everything down. This process by which cells or organisms maintain internal constancy is better known as homeostasis. So homeostasis is the process by which a cell or an organism maintains its internal constancy. I'm going to say that like 3 times. Just make sure you know what homeostasis means. So this whole process of our bodies kind of correcting for extra heat or extra cold is the process by which we maintain homeostasis. And that's for pretty much every organism goes through this at some point or another. So the big thing is that this ultimately means an organism must be able to sense its environment and respond to stimuli in its environment. So that way everything doesn't just die. In other words, if you're a single-celled organism or a human, you need to be able to tell if the heat is changing to be able to then have your body correspond and try to fix it. Fairly straightforward. So let's jump to the next segment of what we call a characteristic of life: reproduction, growth, and development. So organisms can reproduce, grow, and develop. One of these ways can be asexual, which in asexual reproduction, only one parent is involved and the offspring is genetically identical to the parent. Obviously, we primarily think of this through single-cell organisms, where they're going to be a single cell and they're going to divide into 2, where we have a mother cell dividing into 2 daughter cells. But this often occurs in quite a lot of other things too. Asexual reproduction occurs in plants, it occurs in animals all the time. And, it was probably the dominant way of reproduction for a long time until sexual reproduction kind of beat it out in the last, say, 200 to 300, maybe a little bit longer than that, say 400 to 500 million years. And that's the thing, is you need to remember asexual reproduction is a successful strategy, but it has to be in an unchanging environment. So that does kind of influence things a little bit more there too. So, for instance, a strawberry plant can sometimes reproduce asexually. Each of these plantlets is identical to the parent, but because it's identical to the parent, that means there's more chances for things like environmental changes or all that kind of fun stuff to ultimately hinder the animal's ability to function, or the plant's ability to function. And, this can lead to sometimes in certain instances where an animal or a plant can swap between multiple different kinds of reproductive strategies. So say, for instance, in a lot of snake species, they're primarily classic sexual reproduction where it requires 2 parents. However, there's also asexual times where they can reproduce asexually, just to make sure that they're still preserving that generation of genes till the next generation. So kind of using that to jump into what is sexual reproduction. In sexual reproduction, you have 2 parents involved, and the offspring are genetically different from the parent. Basically, it's taking bits of mom and bits of dad and combining it together to form a single organism. Sexual reproduction is a successful strategy in a changing environment and allows for a lot more chances for adaptation, because you're basically constantly reshuffling the deck and giving your new offspring a chance to survive using different attributes. And because of this, they're unlike any of their parents, at least 100%. And now keep in mind that most plants and animals reproduce sexually. So for instance, the swans that you see in the picture, but that doesn't rule out that they can also some can potentially reproduce asexually. So the big thing to remember is that once these, is not only does reproduction, you have to be able to grow and develop as an organism as well. So these plantlets and the swans and the little baby snakes all started as a single cell, whether that be, a single cell that was, split off from the parent, a single parent, or, a combination of your classic egg and sperm situation. Um, it doesn't matter how it starts, but ultimately they're going to start, if they're, a multicellular organism, they're going to start as a single cell and slowly divide and create and grow. So, you look at, say, the little swans, they look totally different from their parents right now, but, in about a year or so, they're going to look just like their parents, relatively speaking. And so ultimately that's that growth and development that you're expecting. So growth is just purely size in this context. So, obviously those plants are just going to really grow the same. They're not going to really change shape or anything like that too much. Whereas development is when you're really transitioning from different shapes. So for instance, like a tadpole to an adult frog, or in this case, the little chick swans into a full-grown swan. They look totally different until they go through that developmental process. So that's reproduction, growth, and development. Let's get into probably the more sticky of all these subjects, evolution. So evolution is the genetic change over time in a population. So the genes in this population of bacteria that you see have changed over time. A new gene conferring antibiotic resistance appeared in this population, whether that be through genetic mutation, which, mind you, occurs like 1 in a million chance. So, it's not going to occur all that often. So, we're not all going to, become superheroes anytime soon. But there are things that can influence that as well. And once that new gene appears, if it's beneficial and it helps that particular organism survive better than all the other organisms in that group, guess what's going to get passed on to the next generation? So if you're treating that population with that one individual that has antibiotic resistance and everybody else is just going to get killed by the antibiotic, maybe that antibiotic resistance causes that particular cell to not be as strong compared to regular cells. But when you introduce an antibiotic, guess which one survives? So when you do introduce that antibiotic, obviously the antibiotic resistant cells are the ones that are most likely to stay around. But if you don't introduce an antibiotic, you're going to probably keep a fairly similar proportion, if not lose out that antibiotic resistance animal or organism. Now, this is unfortunately a really kind of stressful thing, because it means that we have to be kind of careful with how we use particular antibiotics and all that kind of fun stuff. So not only does this stuff matter, and from a scientific perspective of, oh, this is really neat, it's, it can be potentially life or death. So it's something we really do need to consider. So all organisms evolve. Only some of those organisms survive and reproduce. So kind of the grand question is, how is it that we see so many organisms seem perfectly situated to a particular environment? So for example, this pygmy seahorse is so well hidden from predators because it's developed so many little adaptations that have allowed it to look like its substrate, and so it blends right in. And ultimately, the more and more it looks like its substrate, the more and more chances that it's going to survive, reproduce, and then pass along its own genes. And ultimately, you kind of have this driving force that's pushing you towards looking a particular way or acting a particular way. Another great example of this is deer. So, your typical white-tailed deer that you find all around the U.S. There's strong sexual selection. In other words, there's strong pressure because females prefer males with bigger antlers, that the deer with the bigger antlers are probably going to be more preferentially selected for, which means they're going to be more common. However, when you introduce European hunters in the 1800s and 1900s, which were targeting those animals, that pressure from the hunters then changed it to where you're going to see a lot more males with smaller antlers. So it just kind of depends on who survives. It's not always this, survival of the fittest is kind of a weird notion. And to be honest, it's often used to kind of justify some things that are pretty unsavory. So we have to be kind of careful with that. Ultimately, the offsprings that have the genes that allow them to blend in the environment are going to be the ones that survive. Let's jump back to that antibiotic resistance and bacteria example. So bacteria are going to reproduce and evolve quickly. because they're single-cell organisms. They've got a reproduction time of like 30 minutes sometimes, even less in some cases. So they're able to constantly undergo change and potentially adapt because they're given so much time. Basically, because they have such a short generation time, it doesn't take long for specific adaptations to become fixed in a population, and they do really well. So remembering back to this example, this red cell has a different gene than the green cells, which makes them resistant to the effects of antibiotics, but it may also be more energetically costly to do that. So, when its population is not exposed to antibiotics, you see that, there's maybe one or two of those individuals that have that antibiotic resistance present. Now, say we introduce the antibiotic again. Obviously, the antibiotic is going to kill all of those green cells and leave primarily red cells, whereas if we don't introduce that, the selection is going to favor, because of energetic costs, the green cells. So antibiotic resistance is probably most successful when antibiotics are present, because again, it is energetically costly. You're not going to do something if it's going to take you more energy to do it. It's like, why would you walk 30 miles when you can drive a car or ride a bike and get there much faster and without burning as much energy, right? It's that kind of mentality. Obviously, humans are kind of weird in that regard because we have, extrinsic needs, and we can be a little bit more philosophical about things, but still a lot of stuff to think about. Now that we've kind of broke down those 5 characteristics of life, we'll start kind of getting into what are the groups of life. So again, remember that we have these 5 characteristics of life: organization, energy, internal constancy, reproduction, growth and development, and evolution. Everything that is classified as living should have these, at least for the most part. There's always some kind of funky ones. Specifically speaking of that, you have something, viruses. So in this case, it's the Ebola virus. Now, many people combine viruses and bacteria in the term category of germs because they're microscopic and they carry diseases. But viruses are definitely not the same thing as bacteria. And although viruses may look like a cell, they're not at all. They have a very, very small amount of genetic material that's enclosed in a protein shell. And so when a virus replicates in a host cell, random mutations occur in its genetic info. Some is kept and some is lost, based off of how the new mutations facilitate the survival of the virus, which is how evolution works. So in this case, we have evolution, right? There is some sort of mechanism that's causing this virus to evolve, but it's not necessarily maintaining its own homeostasis, so that's a strike against it. So, it doesn't have a cell, it doesn't have anything, its own controlling mechanisms, and it's reliant on another organism to be able to reproduce. So in theory, it's probably not. So let's kind of break this down a little bit more specifically. It doesn't metabolize energy. So in other words, it's all of its, energy needs are being derived from its host. It doesn't respond to stimuli because it's just its own thing. It doesn't truly reproduce. The cell's mechanisms that it invades does it for it. However, the virus can evolve. So it makes it really, really difficult to try to piece a lot of this stuff apart. So scientists use taxonomy to name and classify organisms. So basically, this is how we start kind of breaking apart what we define as one thing and what we define as another. So we often group these organisms based off of their features. So that could include, a physical structure. So, humans and apes both have, 5 fingers and 5 toes, right? So maybe that's how we could classify humans and apes in the same group. As well as you can look at chemistry. So we all use, both humans and apes use both the same kind of DNA or often share very similar amounts of DNA. So say, for instance, humans and chimpanzees only differ by about 1%. Mind you, that 1% is a huge difference, but, it's still 1% of a difference. And then, that's that whole sequencing of their DNA. So it all kind of just depends. And from this taxonomy, we can reveal evolutionary relationships. Like we talked about humans and apes, right? So more than likely, humans are derived from apes because we share a lot of the same kind of characteristics. And so basically, by classifying organisms, ultimately the goal is to help show how closely are related to each other, which could then answer a lot more broader questions about, say, for instance, you have two very similar species on the totally different sides of the planet. Maybe they have similar ecology needs or similar conservation needs. It all just kind of depends. So this graph that you see over here on the left is called a phylogenetic tree. And the closer together the branches are, the more related an organism is. And we'll more on that later. So all organisms share common ancestors. So in this phylogenetic tree you see on your left, you have the last common ancestor of all mammals, which is some sort of reptile back in the early Triassic, maybe a little bit before that. At some point, a group of them broke off and became the monotreme, so your egg-laying mammals. So that's the platypus and the echidna. Then a group broke off and became the marsupials, which are the pouch mammals, which are the ones that have very, very early on development that don't have much of, I believe they don't have a placenta is what really ultimately defines it. And then finally you get to your placental mammals. So that's humans, whales, dogs, cats, bats, all that kind of fun stuff. So a human is more closely related to a kangaroo than it is to a platypus because we share a more recent common ancestor between the human and the kangaroo. So you'll see where the branch occurs, it's a little bit farther away from that last common ancestor of all mammals. Pretty straightforward. So there's ultimately 8 levels of taxonomic hierarchy. Now keep in mind there's a lot of subdivisions in this, so it gets a little messy. So all living organisms are organized into these 8 levels. The most inclusive is domain, and the least inclusive is species. So kind of going back to the tree that we saw earlier, you have 3 domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. So eukarya are all multicellular organisms as well as some single-cell organisms, and they're defined by the presence of certain things within the cell structure. Then you have bacteria and archaea, which are their own deal entirely, and are usually only single-celled and are usually lacking either a nucleus or a lot of other things. I'm trying not to get too specific because things do kind of alter a lot. The best part about biology and the worst part about biology is things change so much, and that ultimately, you pretty much have a caveat for just about any statement, which is kind of frustrating and kind of glorious at the same time. So all 3 of these domains include one or more kingdoms, which is that next group down. So that represents thousands or millions of different species. So when we're, say, talking about the eukarya group, we may talk about Protista, which is this big, polyphyletic, which means multiple origins, groupings, where it's like all the just kind of grab bags of single-celled organisms that are thrown in eukarya. But it also includes things like fungi, animals, and plants. Those are your big kingdoms that we often think about. So getting back into life's 3 domains, with bacteria and archaea, this is kind of what you think of your classic single-celled organism bacteria. They are prokaryotic and unicellular. Again, prokaryotic means that their cells lack a nuclei and often other compartments. So they're not going to have the chloroplasts that you see in plant cells per se, or mitochondria that you see in animal cells. In fact, it's often hypothesized that mitochondria and chloroplasts were kind of derived from the fact that a single-celled organism ate another cell, and instead of consuming it, it probably got incorporated into that cell's mechanical architecture. And now bacteria and archaea do differ, but we're going to examine that differences in later lectures. So getting back into the eukarya domain, you have kingdom Protista. Protists are the most diverse group of eukaryotes. They're kind of, again, they're the grab bag. They're just about everything else that doesn't make any sense to put into prokaryotic stuff. So they are unicellular or multicellular. So you can have a single cell protist or an amoeba, which has hundreds of cells. And they can be both heterotrophs or autotrophs. So that's kind of interesting. In fact, I believe a lot of green algae is considered a protist. And it's just a really diverse group, and it's not a group you're necessarily going to think of. In fact, one of the pathogens that I study for my work is a Protus pathogen that kills leopard frogs. So kind of neat. Then you get to kingdom Animalia. So this is your other kingdom, one of your other four main kingdoms in Eukaryota. This isn't going to include vertebrates such as fish, frogs, humans, whatever. These are all multicellular and primarily heterotrophs by ingestion. So an organism in this domain, remember, they have more complex cells with nuclei. Then we're going to move into the most closely related kingdom to animals, which is the fungi. These are nature's decomposers. Basically, they're all multicellular, or well, most are multicellular, and they're primarily heterotrophs, but they do this through external digestion. So it's not by consuming another organism, it's by having these hyphae that move along the ground, and as they find, matter, organic matter, they'll try to take it into their body. And then finally, you get to the kingdom Plantae, or plants. These are primarily producers that capture life, or the light and energy from the sun. They're multicellular and they're primarily autotrophs. That doesn't mean that not all plants are autotrophs. Again, that whole caveat thing with biology, there's a lot of them. So we can break this all down and look at this like grand scale of biology. We're using science or scientific inquiry to ask questions and form hypotheses and run experiments about life. And then you have this just more general concept of what life is, with its organization, reproduction and growth and development, and all this stuff that it requires to basically exist. So kind of neat. So here's something that kind of breaks down some of that as well. Keep in mind that next week next lecture we're going to get into the chemistry of life. So this is something that you'll see a little bit more of, where we'll look closer at the atoms and the molecules of that organization stuff that we talked about right at the beginning. So here's some additional videos that you guys can look at. I'll leave links to them in the module section, and hopefully that will help get you through a lot of this kind of stuff. And I hope y'all are enjoying these lectures. Obviously, it's not perfectly ideal. I'd much rather be giving to y'all these lectures in person. And, hopefully as we kind of move along in the semester, we can incorporate some more fun stuff like talking, especially when we get into ecology and conservation. I'll have some live critters that I'll be able to show you guys too. So I hope y'all are enjoying this. And in the meantime, please remember to keep studying and don't forget to finish those 2 quizzes by the end of the week.